Hey guys, we are now on chapter 15, and this is going to be video 3. You guys can see this chapter 15. These notes are really long. This is the majority of your notes for this unit. So on video 2, I stopped right here at natural selection. Just started talking about that. This is the big idea, the very end conclusion of Darwin's theory. Lots of little parts sort of leading up to this big idea. That nature selects, and not that nature picks. What happens is nature or an environment is what it is. And then whoever has the adaptations that make you most fit in that environment, those are the ones that are selected, or the ones who are allowed to survive and then reproduce. Okay. And then this one, 25, make sure that you guys know that this results in a change in populations, not individuals. Okay. Remember, if I jump out the window and the grass is green, I don't change green. I am not the most fit to blend into that environment. Okay, descent with modification is the idea that living things, it is exactly as it sounds. Descent as in genetics being descended from parents to their offspring. They're descended with the mutations that came from their ancestors. So you guys have traits from your parents, and they have traits from their parents. What happens with species over a long period of time is we start with a common ancestor that has a certain characteristic. Like, let's say that everything in the world that has a spinal cord, okay? Darwin's theory says that all those living things that currently have a spinal cord, think fish, lizards, mammals, whales, well, whales are mammals, humans, chimpanzees, all those things have a spinal cord. They all, millions of years ago, had some ancestor that developed the first spinal cord, okay? And so that was part of a mutation or a series of mutations that created that. And then everything that has been descended from that had that modification. Now, obviously, it's changed. The spinal cord that you have is different from a whale's spinal cord, but it's one trait that's descended through the generations. So you are descended with modifications from your parents, okay? The principle of common descent, going back to that common ancestor, is the idea that all species, all living things have a common ancestor. Then we can break that down into things like everything with a spinal cord had some common ancestor with a spinal cord. Everything that's a mammal, that's warm-blooded and has fur, at some point in time had an ancestor that was the first mammal, that had those first characteristics. Everything that is a lizard, there's some common ancestor that had all those characteristics of a lizard, okay? And that all species are descended from some common ancestors. So forget about the idea that one thing evolves from something else. That's not how that works. You have a common ancestor, and then just like branches on a family tree, you have different directions with different mutations that species can take. Okay, so if you have the common ancestor down here that has a spinal cord, you've got fish that evolved in this direction, and you have reptiles that evolved in this direction, and you have warm-blooded organisms that evolved in this direction. Okay. Now Darwin has 4 pieces of evidence. On your fill-in-the-blank notes, you guys, you don't have to fill these in. You have these, but just to present these to you, you have to memorize these 4. If we take all this stuff that we've been talking about and we condense it down into 4 different ideas, here are the 4 ideas. Okay. Fossil record, geographic distribution of living species, homologous body structures, remember the prefix homo means same, and similarities in embryology. Embryo, think something developing in the womb. For each one of these 4, you guys will need to, if you look at your list of skills, you guys will need to tell me all 4, and then you need to describe it or use examples to support it, okay? So the fossil record. Organisms that are alive today come from organisms that have lived before or were extinct. And we don't do that because we can go back in time and tell you exactly what happened. We do it using fossils of former living organisms that we can compare to organisms today. Like, remember way back to the armadillos in the first video? We have fossils of these huge armadillos that are not alive today, but we do have little smaller armadillos, a species that's alive today that's really similar to that one. So we think that that large armadillo is very closely related to the small armadillo. Now, there were a lot of different environmental pressures that could have caused the smaller armadillo to survive better than the larger ones, but over millions of years, okay, one didn't necessarily evolve into the other, but maybe the larger species died out, and as smaller and smaller and smaller armadillos survived, we ended up with the kind that we have now. Okay, and we have to do that using fossils. So, and a way for you to explain this, I'm so sorry, would be to talk about some kind of example where we use any kind of fossil to compare to living things today. Like we use fossils of dinosaurs to compare to birds. Okay, we use the fossil of the armadillo to compare to armadillos today. We use fossils of early primates to compare to humans and primates today. Okay, so any example of how we use a fossil to look at what's alive today could be a good explanation for fossil record. All right, here's an example. This is evolution of a common ancestor of horses and probably also zebras and llamas, camels, up until we get to the modern horse, which is this one, Equus, up here at the top. If you guys can see, we can use fossil evidence to show how when we had this much smaller horse, look at this thing, it looks like a little teeny tiny goat, that's crazy. It lived in an environment that probably had like softer, squishier ground. And for some reason, not exactly sure why, it was more beneficial for them to be small. And so they had almost toes instead of hooves. You guys know horses have a hard hoof because they're usually moving across dry, hard ground. And so that hoof helps them to push off of that hard ground. Well, this early ancestor of the horse probably lived on spongier ground. So it had those fingers to support itself, and push off of that spongy ground. And as the environment changed and mutations within the species changed, we got all of these different species here. So each one of these, you guys, is a different species of horse, but they have this common ancestor. So we use this fossil record to compare an early ancestor to what horses are today. All right, guys, here we go. Back to, sorry about that. I got kind of interrupted in the middle of my live video there. So fossil record, number one. Number two, geographic distribution of living species. You can kind of look at this in two ways. Think geographic, where a species is located. And you can look at this in terms of fossils and living species, or any species who have lived, okay? My definition says similar but unrelated species in different places get the same adaptations. So think about that like, so organisms that live in deserts all over the world. We've got deserts in South America, we've got deserts in Africa, we've got deserts in Asia, we've got deserts in the United States, Australia. So think about, and even Antarctica and the North Pole you could think of as a desert, it's just really cold. We've got species in all of those areas, and because they're under the same environmental pressures, they develop a lot of the same traits. So they can go without water for a long time. The plants are the kind of plants that are going to store water. They're not going to be really flowering plants. So they're species that aren't really closely related if we looked at their DNA, but they develop the similar traits because they're in similar places and have similar environmental pressures on them. Organisms that live in the cold all over the world have really thick fur or really thick blubber, even if their DNA doesn't look like it matches exactly. The other way that you can look at that is looking at fossils. I'll show you guys a picture. If you look at fossils of organisms all over the world, think back to Pangea. If you guys don't remember what Pangea is, that's when all of our continents were all together before they drifted apart millions of years ago. If we look at organisms on like this coast of South America and organisms on this coast of Africa, not only looking at fossils but also living organisms, we can see organisms that show similarities even though they're completely across oceans. Okay, we have two really, really large birds that live on these two continents. Okay, really large birds, the emu and the ostrich, really very similar DNA, very similar adaptations, but living on two completely separate continents. So that shows us that at one point in time, they may have been a part of the same gene pool. Okay, this one's showing you some organisms that are alive today and some that are extinct. Giant armadillo, obviously extinct. Giant anteater, I believe, is still alive. I don't believe they're extinct yet. And the pangolin and the spiny anteater are also all live species. But if you look at them, they all display some really similar traits. So that means one of two things. They're either under the same environmental pressures, so they're eating the same kind of organisms, or they all were at some point in time had maybe a common ancestor that lived in